From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of season 2. I'm Nick Schildberger. This episode, we hear from Mic Cavazzini, producer of the award-winning Pomegranate Health, a podcast for the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. But first, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
G'day, Nick. It's encouraging to see a lot more organisations are using podcasts as a way of communication, but I've been talking to some organisations about their podcasts, and it's becoming pretty clear that they're struggling with them, not quite understanding what works and what doesn't work, yet going ahead with producing them anyway. And I think what we're finding, I'll give an example in a minute, but I think what we're finding is that podcasting is very much like the Wild West. It's the early days of podcasting, very much like the internet was back, 20 years ago, when people were just getting on board creating a website. And if you look back today at those early websites, they look hideous. And that's, I think, what a lot of podcasts are sounding, with companies that don't quite know what they're doing, and they're sounding pretty hideous.
Hideous is a strong word, but I get your point. And I also think that video was similar not that many years ago, and probably even still today. But people thought, everyone's got to have a video on your website. You've got to do video. And so people were filming stuff on their iPhones, throwing it up to YouTube. And were they really thinking about, is this what I should be doing for my brand or for my business? Is this the quality that my customers and prospects are going to expect? And I think the momentum behind podcasting at the moment, we could see the same thing start to happen, that people will produce stuff that perhaps isn't quite, if they sat down and looked at their marketing strategy, does this really fit in with what we should be doing?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm hearing, or seeing rather. There's a particular organisation I was in contact with, and they were quite proud of the fact they've got a podcast. Well, good on you. They failed with not providing something basic like a player, an audio player. So they're not using, say, a podcasting platform or host like Omni Studio that we use, or Whooshka. They're putting the MP3 as a link to click on. Now, either you right-click it and download it onto your computer, like the year 2000, or you click on that and it opens up, that black screen with that, MP3 player inside it.
It's not a very friendly way to listen to audio.
It's awful. And so, and it's not on iTunes. So that's a big fail there, but not even understanding that. The other thing too is then listening to it, and obviously the audio quality is pretty rubbish, and the way they've put it together, and without any thought of editing or cleaning the audio. So I think, people want to get into doing podcasting, that's great, but if this reflects the quality of what they're putting out there, why are they doing it? Have they even thought about, is this a good strategy for them? I think that's important. And then going into doing it professionally is the next thing.
And what concerns me is the Me Too, where other businesses are going to want to get into podcasting, and they're going to look at what's out there. And if the majority of what they're seeing is the example you've just given, they're going to go, that's how you do it. And they throw up the same thing and you've got the same results. So.
That's right, yeah. It's like the early days of the internet. You remember if a web page hadn't been completed and you see that, I'm sorry, we're under construction, and they have a little GIF of somebody digging a hole.
Yeah.
That we look back now, that's ridiculous. So you don't do that. If it's not ready, you just hide the fact that the page is there at all. But that is the equivalent of what we're seeing in audio at the moment. Silly things like that.
Well, we better get to today's interview. Who did you speak to, Chris?
Well, I spoke with Mic Cavazzini. Now, he's the producer of Pomegranate Health, and it won the Career and Industry category at this year's Australian Podcast Awards.
Well done.
Well, in fact, the first time I met him was on stage when I presented him and Annie Fredrickson the award, but I didn't actually talk to them very much. So I rang him up a bit later and asked him to join this podcast. Now, Pomegranate Health is a podcast for the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, and the podcast forms part of the college's professional development resources. So doctors, like any professionals, They have to maintain their skills, which usually means digesting information from a lecture or reading journals or watching webinars. And, they're finding, and a lot of, I suppose, member organisations are finding, that podcasting is a great way to learn. And so for the last couple of years at the College of Surgeons, Mick tells me, podcasting is part of the mix.
If they listen to the podcast, they get CPD points, which hopefully isn't their only motivation for listening. And, most of our physicians, they work in public hospitals that got incredibly busy schedules, on call and so on. So my colleague who started the podcast, Annie Fredrickson, saw that the podcast could be a neat solution to, fitting into such a busy schedule. You can listen on your way to work or while you're cooking or whatever. And her background was she'd co-produced a podcast in the US for the Science History Institute. She'd already seen how effective that could be.
And what are the kind of stories or topics that you have on the podcast?
Yeah, so a few of them are, people often ask me, this is usually the first question, and a few of the topics are clinical ones, like we did a story on severe asthma or one on treating heart attacks. But most of what's considered professional skills, professional development for doctors is more soft skills like communication or cultural competency, big life and death ethical decisions, and we even did a story on gender equity in the medical profession. So it's much broader, more human side of healthcare, which might be interesting not just to doctors but also the wider public.
So the podcasts that you do obviously are for the College of Physicians, for those practitioners, but it seems like a lot of the topics can be interesting for the wider public, do you think? Yeah.
We made a deliberate decision not to put it behind a login password wall so that anyone could listen. And I try and make it accessible and simplify the jargon so that, even casual listeners can sort of see under the hood of how the medical profession works. I think it's good to build that relationship with the public so they understand how the healthcare system works, how doctors see their relationships with patients. Our most downloaded story so far is one about the impacts of medicinal cannabis. It's something that doctors are still uncomfortable with, and the media and the politicians have hyped this up so much that the public often doesn't know what to think. That story's had 8,000 downloads in 6 months.
Now, this is something that is completed in-house. So you're employed by the College of Physicians. They don't outsource the production for this, which is, I suppose, quite unusual for any organisation or company to have somebody with the skills to do it in-house. But what is the process of putting this together? It must take a lot of time to get all the elements and assemble the program, yeah?
Yeah, it is. It might take me a week or two to research every story. I'm not a doctor. I've got a science background, so I can understand some of the language. But I read up on the academic literature and the clinical guidelines and things like that over a week or two, and then try and boil that down to 2 pages of questions for the person I'm interviewing. And that 2 or 3 pages can translate to an hour of conversation. And for each story, I might interview 2 or 3 people. So then you've got 2 or 3 hours of tape, which I try and cut down to half an hour. And that's the really frustrating part. That's the really time-consuming part, which takes a couple of weeks of editing and thinning and restructuring and scripting the narrative and then sending off the drafts to a group of doctors that are sort of editors for me and then re-editing. So it's time-consuming, but I think that the tightness of the final package, it's all killer, no filler. I think that speaks to its popularity, that you can invest half an hour in listening and you get bang for your buck.
Well, it's won a coveted Australian Podcast Award, which is based on merit, based on production values. But what has been the college's reception to the podcast? Have they embraced it, do you think?
Well, yeah, they were very excited about that win. It was good publicity and a sign that the project was a good investment. When it started 3 years ago, it did take a bit of convincing, and this kind of thing hadn't been done before, and they didn't know how much resourcing it would take, and they were a bit nervous about how the message would be controlled. What if something scandalous was said on tape? Would that reflect badly on the college? And that's never been the case. Of course, you can polish it up before you publish, and there's a disclaimer at the end saying that what you hear is just a conversation. It's with these people. It's not the RACP's official stance. It's a conversation starter. So I think people are much more comfortable with it now as a platform for conversation. I think the moral of the story is that it's a popular medium. All sorts of people now are embracing podcasts, and it's versatile. So many different institutions could fit their message into a podcast of some sort.
Now, what about the college's members? Do you get feedback from what they think? Are they listening?
I would like to get more emails and so on, and that's probably the vanity of every radio and host and podcaster. But the numbers are pretty compelling. So each new episode we publish gets about 3,500 downloads within the first month. And according to Rob Walsh of Libsyn, apparently that puts us in the top 10% of all podcasts. The average is only 141 downloads a month, and the top 5% of podcasts are getting 9,000 downloads. So we're on the right end of the curve.
And how does the college amplify the podcast? How do they tell their members about it?
We have a newsletter that goes out every fortnight, I think. There's a college Twitter and Facebook platform, so the comms team are very helpful in promoting it there. We've got a mailing list as well for people that just want to get email alerts every time an episode is published. So hopefully those are doing something, and the word of mouth does the rest.
Now, a big question, of course, is why bother with a podcast at all, do you think? I know you're an advocate for it because it's your livelihood, but the college's other publications, they'd have magazines and newsletters. Wouldn't that be enough? In other words, what makes podcasting an attractive medium?
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, there's a college magazine that comes out every quarter, and it's very well produced, and heaps of stuff on the website and the newsletters. But as I mentioned, doctors are super busy, and probably they're staring at computer screens and so on for a lot of their day. So I think the newsletters and so on get a few hundred clicks, but as soon as that alert is in your inbox is buried by other emails, it's forgotten. Whereas podcasts, you can fit them in anywhere in your day, or in a lot of places in your day that might otherwise be downtime, like your commute. And once you get into the podcast archive, there's a list there of interesting topics that are sort of calling out to be listened to. So even our older episodes get 20 downloads a day or something. So I think, it's got a place in the day, and I'm sure you've spoken plenty on your show about the power of audio for marketing and so on. The fact that radio advertising sinks in more than TV advertising does. So I'm sure that's true of these kind of educational messages as well.
I'd imagine too, physicians are very busy people, and not having the time to sit down and read, perhaps that's the last thing they want to do is read something, but to listen is another way of getting information while they're doing something else.
And, when someone sends you an article or a news article or one of those long-form things that after you've scrolled down 2 pages, your eyes are already tired, whereas I'll happily invest half an hour listening to This American Life or whatever it is, because you are sort of being told a story. It's a much more friendly environment to get information in.
That's right. What advice would you give to any other organisation, particularly a member organisation that might be looking to produce a podcast?
Yeah, well, like I've said, it's such a versatile medium that you really can. There are many ways to skin a cat, and I wouldn't say that this particular format of podcasting is appropriate to every organisation. But I think it needs to promise something. So you can't just assume that the audience is going to be invested because you're a big organisation or because they're paying members and they're going to get CPD credits. If it's boring or if they don't have enough time, then they're not going to put their time in. So you have to promise, what are you going to give them? And like I said, people want to hear a story. My personal taste is that good production makes the world of difference. So if a friend recommends a new podcast to me and I start listening and it just goes straight to some echoey room with bad audio, or it's a crappy phone interview that you can't hear really well, I can't engage quickly. I'm out. And similarly, good editing and scripting, I think, can really make a difference. So it's amazing how many podcasts these days just have the premise that they're going to sit with someone for an hour and just ask them stuff and back and forth for an hour. You need to trim that down. You need to respect your audience. And yeah, like I said before, lay out a bit of an arc for them, a bit of a teaser of where you're going, and break it up with a bit of music and different voices to stop the listener from tuning out, to really keep them engaged.
That's Mic Cavazzini.
Well, that's definitely an example of a podcast that doesn't fall into the category that we were talking about at the start of this episode. And well done for putting the time and effort into producing a podcast of a quality that deserves winning an award at the Australian Podcast Awards. We've actually had, our listeners might not know, but we've actually had a rich history ourselves of producing audio for a whole range of medical associations over several decades. And the reasons Mick summed up pretty well is because they're very busy people, and audio is a great way for them to digest news and information from their colleges, or perhaps do some professional development as well while they're in the car driving between practices or between surgeries, that sort of thing. And we've done audio for pharmacists, doctors, surgeons. Well, we're still doing surgeons now, anaesthetists.
Yes. Yep.
And it's for a lot of the reasons that Mick mentioned, and also not just for them to get their medical information, but for them to learn other soft skills in areas outside of their direct day-to-day job that are interesting, that they need to know, leadership and other things that form a part of their job. I remember with pharmacists back in the day, we used to even provide information on how they should lay out their store, believe it or not. Mm. And the CPD side of things is another great way for them to be able to digest that longer form content without having to actually sit down and read it or watch a webinar, which if you speak to people that actually watch webinars, not many of them actually enjoy the process. So.
Well, they're awful. They're normally a disinterested presenter to start with. Looking at a screen, you've got to sit down, you've got to watch, you've got to pay attention. It's boring. It doesn't have to be, I suppose, but they normally are.
Well, for 23 years, we've been producing CPD audio content for accountants through two programs we do called Business in Focus and Tax in Focus, and each of those are accredited for accountants. I don't know who it was. I'm stealing someone else's line. I really should give them credit, but they said you can't multitask video, and I like that line. It really makes sense for what we do. Accountants have a huge range of webinars and recorded video programs that they can watch, but yet we've had thousands of subscribers to our audio programs so that they can listen on the go. The last point I want to make is about the amplification of Pomegranate Health. Mick mentioned they're doing a good job and they're putting it out through their newsletter and they've got social media going, and the results speak for themselves. They're in the top 10% of downloads. Several thousand is a terrific effort. But I actually think this is an area that I'm seeing quite a bit at the moment, where even if a podcast is produced to the highest quality or to a high quality, that doesn't mean anymore that you're going to automatically get downloads. Just being good doesn't mean people are going to find you. Discovery is becoming a lot more difficult. Our first podcast we produced more than 10 years ago for Business Essentials. We did zero amplification. We were really just testing the waters. We're an audio business, so we thought we should try this new thing called podcasting. It wasn't really part of our business strategy to do that, so we just popped it out there. And we had several thousand downloads to every episode. We didn't fall out of the top 10 on the Apple charts for business, and we did zero amplification. Now, why am I telling you this? You think, oh, great, it's easy. It doesn't happen anymore. You can't do that. You can't just put a podcast out there amongst the other 500,000 podcasts and expect it to be discovered and downloaded. And we stood out back then also because we were producing it professionally in a studio like we are now, because that's our business. And not many, very, very, very few podcasts back then were produced at the quality. Most of them were just people that had no idea trying to record stuff and throwing it up there. I often say it sounded like they'd been recorded in the toilet, which is a little bit harsh, but so that would have helped us be in that top 10, but it was just a numbers game as well. There just weren't that many out there. So when people came across something that was good quality, they listened, and that's how we had several thousand downloads with zero amplification. Well, I think that's it for another episode of Be Podcasting. For more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build your engagement, go to be.com.au. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.